This is a day when lots and lots of people are applying for jobs because of the way the job market is. People are looking to be employed, and lots of forms are being filled in, whether it be online or filled in as a hard copy and sent off to whoever is concerned. And usually a job application asks you for at least two things. The one thing they'll ask you for is your qualifications, and the second thing is your experience. And then at the interview, they'll probably cover both of those things. And really what they're trying to find out is this: are you, or how are you, prepared for or qualified to do this job? That's really what the interview's all about. Is this person suitable for this position? Now, if that job entailed leading 2 million people who had been effectively nomads for the previous 40 years, aimlessly wandering round without purpose in the wilderness, and if you were being called to take a land that was already occupied by many other people, that would be a daunting prospect, wouldn't it? But that was, in effect, the task that was given to Joshua. Now, you'll know a little bit about Joshua, I'm sure, and let me just remind you, Joshua was Moses' aide, or right-hand man, from his youth. He was originally called Hoshea, and Moses gave him a new name. He said, from now on, you're going to be called Joshua. We read in Exodus that Joshua led a band of fighting men against the Amalekites, a local army in the wilderness, and overcame them. Remember, that was the time when Moses went on the hill, and every time his hands were in the air, Joshua was victorious, and when his hands were lowered, Joshua became the second-rate army in the conflict. But ultimately, he achieved victory. You remember then, 12 spies were sent to spy out the land of Canaan. When they came back, 10 of them said, we'll never do it. People are too strong. It's a great land, but we just don't have the resources. But Joshua and Caleb said, if the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into the land, and he will give us the land. And Joshua and Caleb were the only two people over the age of 20 who came out of Egypt into the wilderness, the only two people who survived until the time when they come to enter the land of Canaan. And they've come to the Jordan River. Moses is dying, and he commissions Joshua, and he says to him, Joshua, be strong and courageous, for the Lord is with you. He will not forsake you. And then you remember how we looked at the people crossing the Jordan River by a supernatural event where God parted the waters. And then we read, as we come now to this very well-known event in the life and experience of Joshua and the people of God, we're looking at chapter 5, verse 13, if you want to follow along, and then into chapter 6. We read that Joshua met a man with a sword. The sword was drawn, and Joshua said to him, are you for us, or are you for our enemies? The person said, neither, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. And Joshua said, what message do you have for this servant? And the commander of the Lord's army, this person who he met, said, take off your sandals, because you're standing on holy ground. And Joshua obeyed. And many people believe that that was a pre-incarnation vision of Jesus Christ, the army of the Lord, and he accepted the worship that Joshua gave him. So Joshua is prepared, he's qualified, he's entrusted with the responsibility of taking the people into the land of Canaan. The first thing they're confronted with is the walled city of Jerusalem, or of Jericho, and it's a great obstacle that stands in the way of their progress. And I want just to look at this event. I want to look at two things, essentially. First of all, I want us to notice the plan of God. The plan of God. Now, the city, it tells us, is shut up. In other words, it is closed. The people in the city have heard about the Israelites. They've heard about how they crossed the Jordan River, and they're afraid. They've barricaded themselves in the city. Nobody goes out and nobody goes in. Now, the question is, how are this motley bunch of people going to get access to take the city? They don't have any battering rams. They don't have any ramps that they can set up, that they can go up and climb into the city. This would have been a daunting task. In verse 2, we read this. The Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands with its king and its fighting men." In other words, God is saying to Joshua, I will ensure that you have success in your mission to overcome the city of Jericho. And then God explained the tactics to Joshua. He said, Joshua, I want the armed guard, some of your armed men, to go in front. And then behind them, I want 7 priests to blow trumpets. Behind them, we carry the Ark of the Covenant. Remember what we said about that? If you've seen the film The Raiders of the Lost Ark, that's what they were looking for. It was the golden box in which we had the commandments of God and the staff that Aaron had that became alive, and some bread that God gave them in the desert. Those were the 3 things that God says. Carry the Ark of the Covenant behind the armed guard, and then behind them we want another guard. And then the people are to follow. And God said to Joshua, then I want you to march, everybody, in that order, and I want you to march around the city. And I want you to do it in silence. Apart from the ram's horns, which are to be blown, I want you to be quiet, completely quiet. You're to do it once, you're to go right around the city once, and you're to come back to camp. Then I want you to repeat it for 6 days. And then God says to him, on the 7th day, I want you to go around 7 times, again in silence. And the last time you go round, Joshua, you will give the command. The people will shout all at once. The trumpets will be blown. You know what's going to happen, Joshua? The walls are going to collapse. And you're going to go in and take the city. Now, can you imagine Joshua's response? We would have understood if he had said, now, Lord, are you sure about this? You mean the walls are just going to fall down and we're going to be able to go in? But remember this, Joshua had seen the plagues in Egypt. Joshua had seen the Red Sea parted and the people go across. Joshua had been there when the Jordan was separated. He had had a vision of God along with Moses, and he knew that if God said it, then it was possible. So what does he do? Well, he tells the priests. He doesn't tell them the whole story. He doesn't tell them what's going to happen in the end. He just tells them this is what they have to do. They have to march around the city, and then they have to come back. The same thing the next day, to be a great procession. We can imagine whenever Joshua would tell the people, maybe they would say, Joshua, is this it? I mean, is this all we have to do? We just go around the city and then we come home again? What is this going to achieve? Can we imagine the people in the city of Jericho as the people walked round? The first day they might have been afraid. The second day they might have been baffled. The third day they may have been amused. And the fourth day they might have mocked the people. Here they come again. They're going to do their wee tour of our city and then they're going to hike off. You can imagine them making jokes. Now here's the thing, you see, these instructions do not make sense in any normal terms. They're foolish. These are absurd tactics for anyone to be given in a military conflict. But this is God's way, and the people obeyed, and they did what they were asked. And Hebrews 11 tells us that by faith they were able to enter into Jericho. They trusted the instructions that God gave to them through Joshua. They took God at his word. They believed what he said, and they acted accordingly. Now, we may find ourselves in very similar situations. Now, it's not about cities for us. It's not about walls, but it's about the journey of life, isn't it? And we discover principles that God sets before us that seem utterly foolish. They often don't make sense. Let me mention one or two of them. God tells us if we want to really find life, then we've got to give our lives up to him. God says if we want to be first, then we've got to make ourselves last. He says if we want to be great, then we are to make ourselves a servant. He tells us it's more blessed to give than to receive. We're counseled to invest our lives and what we are and what we have, not in earthly treasures, but in heavenly treasures. God tells us that if somebody strikes us on the one cheek, we're to turn the other. We're called to love our enemies and to pray for those who persecute us and want to use us. The Bible tells us that if we serve God with our lives, we're actually free. If we obey his commands, we will be enriched. And if we submit to him, we will be liberated. It calls us to forgive without limit. It tells us that we're blessed if people insult us and speak all manner of evil against us. It tells us that if we belong to Christ, even though we die, yet shall we live. It tells us that there is a place beyond this world where there is no sorrow or crying or death or pain. There is a new heaven and a new earth where we might live forever. Now, sometimes when we read those things, we say, yes, it would be nice if it was true. Seems foolish. And so did this. And yet the reason is because God's ways are not our ways. Our thoughts are not his thoughts. It's a different kingdom, different principles. And they seem to be foolish, but here is the most important thing, that when we take these truths to ourselves, we discover that they are not foolish as we might have thought, but they are the essence of life itself. The plan of God seemed foolish, and God's plan and purpose and promises seems foolish to us today. But remember where they come from. Remember the source. The second thing then I want to look at is the power of God. The power of God. We know the story. On the seventh day, the people walked round 6 times round the city. Now that was bound to have taken the people in the city by surprise because they were expecting another tour and away. This time they keep going 6 times in silence. And the last time round the city, the 7th time, the trumpets are sounded, Joshua gives the command, everybody shouts, and the Bible tells us that the walls of that city tumbled down. And the people were able to go straight into that city and destroyed it completely. God kept his promise to Joshua and to the people. He was as good as his word, foolish as it might have seemed. And the people did what God called them to do, and then God did what they simply couldn't. Now, some people looking at this say, well, actually, what happened was that the shouting and the marching and the trumpets caused vibrations on the ground. And the vibrations caused the wall to tumble down. In the same way that if you've ever seen an opera singer reaching a very high note, they can break a glass. Well, people said that's effectively what happened. Well, maybe it did. Maybe it didn't. But the point is this: God was in it. And he gave the victory. that the people could never have had on their own. Now, you maybe say to me, well, it's an interesting story. There's great drama there. The kids love it, don't they? But what's it got to do with me? Well, let me remind you. Each of us face obstacles as we journey through life. We are confronted by difficulties, not cities, but other issues that stand before us like Jericho stood before these people. They tower over us and cast a shadow over our lives. Now let me just mention one or two things. If you're a Christian, here are things that you might find difficult in life. These things might be obstacles to you. Maybe there's a person in your life, and that person looms large in your mind. Maybe it's somebody from the past. Maybe they did you harm, or they deceived you, or betrayed you, and they're often in your thoughts. And maybe worst of all, they told you that they were a Christian, and you believe that they were simply a hypocrite. Maybe there's somebody for you, and it's at this moment in time, they're present today, and you find them very difficult. And maybe they're in your family, or maybe the place that you work. You see them often, you're in contact with them, even though you'd probably rather not, and they just simply bug you to death. Or maybe for you it's a habit. Maybe a practice that has got a grip of you, and you would love to be rid of it, and it dominates your life. It is a thorn in your flesh. It is an obstacle as you travel along the road. Or maybe you've got yourself into some deep pit in some way. Maybe financially you're up to your eyes. Maybe morally there is an area of life that you are disregarding the principles of God about purity. You're feeding the flesh. Maybe there's some sin that you have allowed to get a foothold in your life, and it's been putting roots into your heart. And maybe it's anger or bitterness or resentment, and it festers there. And it's always before you. Or maybe it's something that you ought to do and you haven't done. Maybe there's somebody that you need to be reconciled to, somebody that you need to forgive, or maybe ask them to forgive you. Maybe somebody that you have hurt and you need to put it right with them. Now here's the important thing. Whatever it is for you, if you are serious, and if you are willing to do what God asks, and to march round the walls, as it were, God's promise to you is that He will give you the power to deal with those things. And if you mean business with God, He will do business with you. Now, maybe there needs to be a bit of persistence. Because we can imagine the people of Israel walking around the wall and coming back to their camp at Gilgal and saying, well, that was a fat lot of use, wasn't it? That didn't achieve anything. And then they do it the second time. Well, we're still no further forward. The third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth. They'd be saying, what's happening here? We're wasting our time. And sometimes we just need to keep at it. Keep persevering. But if we truly want what we know is right, God promises, He says, I am able to keep you from falling and to present you before His glorious presence without fault and with great joy. You see, here's the thing. The God who opened the Jordan, the God who caused the walls of Jericho to fall, the God who brought Jesus Christ from death in the tomb back to life, is able. And He can help you overcome. There's a verse in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, and it says this. We'll put it on the screen. For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. Divine power to demolish strongholds. Do you need God's help? Do you need His grace and His power? Are you serious? Well, God says when you work it out, He will work in you. Now let me finish by saying maybe you're not a Christian here this morning. Decent person, be regular at church. But there's an obstacle before you. You'd love to be on the path, but there's a Jericho in your way, and it might go something like this. You just feel that you'll never be able to make it. A lady said to me on one occasion, I could never keep all the rules. Well, let me stress to you, it is not about keeping the rules. God doesn't say, come to me and I will make you perfectly obedient. It's primarily about love for God. It's about belonging to Him and walking the path with His presence in our lives. It's about being forgiven today and tomorrow and for the rest of our lives. It's about living in relationship with our Creator. Or maybe you feel, as you look at the Christian life and you think, well, I would love to be on the path, but you feel that you'll lose your joy and it will be a life of drudgery. Well, let me remind you, Jesus said, I've come to give life, life abundant, and life that is full. Here's something very interesting. The name Joshua in the Old Testament means the Lord saves. Do you know what the New Testament equivalent of that name is? Jesus. It's the same name, Joshua in the Old Testament, Jesus in the New Testament. He is able to save us and to keep us and to give us life. You've seen Him doing it for other people. You know people who were far from God and they came to Him and they were changed. So you know it's true. You know it can happen. And He can do it for you. I wonder if you've ever been to the zoo. Well, if you have, you've probably seen one of these creatures. They're lovely, aren't they? Lovely as long as you don't get too close to them. But now, I'm not knocking the zoo here. I've been there plenty of times. We had many's a happy day at the zoo. But a lion is not meant to be in a cage or restricted. A lion is meant to run and to roam and to hunt. That's the way it has been made. That's what it's for. And when it's encaged and cooped up, it is not able to live the life that it was made to live. Now, you see, if you and I are outside of Jesus Christ, we're effectively cooped up. We're in a cage. Because we were meant for God. And true freedom is to live life with Him and for Him. Maybe you're someone who carries a burden. It's an affliction that weighs heavily on your heart. You would love to be rid of it, but you can't be. You know it's never going to go away, and you wonder if you'll be able to bear it. You see, there are times when God does not remove the things that are in front of us, but He gives us courage and endurance to keep on and not to live in despair, but to live with hope. And I want to finish just by, in a moment or two, playing a song that's sung by Joni Eareckson. Now, some of you will know of Joni Eareckson. She was 17 when she was in a diving accident, and she became a quadriplegic through that. No use of her arms or legs. You can't imagine anything that would be harder. But Joni paints, she speaks to Christian groups, and she sings. And this track, which is called Joni's Waltz, is her testimony. And this is about a woman who has a major, major burden, a real obstacle in life that could have destroyed her. She's now 63, so she's lived for 46 years with this Jericho always before her. And the words, I trust, will be inspiring. And I believe they're full of hope. So let's hear this, and then we'll